Hi everyone, this is Andrew Primer, a Ukrainian American reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 154 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the second week of February 2025. In this podcast, we're going to talk about the Munich conference and how European Union and Ukraine were humiliated by the Trump administration. Munich conference last week raised tensions, big tensions among the European allies and Ukraine itself. Seems like the United States started taking a little bit different position toward the war in Ukraine. By supporting Ukraine's side in its war against Russia until January 2025, the United States has generated enormous power against an aggressor Russia and its patron China. At a little financial cost and no risk to the United States troops, American policy has helped the Ukrainian armed forces provide a broader security that the US could not have achieved on its own. The Ukrainian fulfilled NATO's in-time mission, repelling a Russian invasion and destroying most of the Russian army in 2022. It is difficult to judge US policy toward Ukraine as Americans contradict each other and themselves faster than any stopwatch or Twitter can keep up. However, two fundamental principles were formulated in the Munich Security Conference last week. The first was that Ukraine, like all of Europe, should be seen not as an American ally but as an American colony. The humiliating discussions about the disposition of Ukraine's resources made it very clear. The second idea was that the war could be ended through direct negotiations between the Americans and the Russian aggressor. There was no sign of serious substantive preparation for such negotiations on the American side. So it seems like the purpose of the phone call between dictator Putin and Donald Trump and the upcoming Russian American talks in Saudi Arabia on Ukraine is to conclude a bad deal, at least from the point of view of the lives of Ukrainians, American power, and peace in the world. If a bad deal is nevertheless reached, it will be difficult to say whether it is manifestation or incompetence, design or incompetence by design. I think the latter is most likely. The structure of the situation doesn't set the stage for seriousness and deliberation. The Americans are in a hurry, as Trump's special envoy to Ukraine constantly says, and this doesn't contribute to the planning of the negotiations. Since the Ukrainians and Europeans will not be present at these talks, Putin will likely get his way on the main issues. One or another American official has already publicly conceded most of them. They, although admittedly, they have often since retracted their words or been contradicted by others. Trump and Musk have been repeating the Russian thesis for years. Putin will apparently be treated as a legitimate partner, will go unpunished for his war crimes, will receive actual territorial gains from the aggressive war, and will be able to dictate the terms of Ukrainian domestic policy. He will celebrate victory and prepare for the next war in complete confidence that the US will be unable to resist him. In other words, Russia will gain from American diplomacy a strength it could not gain on the battlefield. The consensus among informed observers here in Munich is that the war is going well for Russia. Sanctions are working, and the Russian economy collapse predicted for 2026 now looks like more likely this year. On the battlefield, Russia's losses far outweighed Ukraine's, and the Ukrainians are getting better and better at hurting the Russians without putting their own people at risk. The obvious way to end the war is to strengthen Ukraine and weaken Russia. The tools are in hand. Instead, the United States is strengthening Russia. and stress in Ukraine. As we all understand, a bad deal on Ukraine would seem to serve only Russia, but it also serves America's policy or deliberate weakness, designed to create a world that is softer on Musk and Trump's emotions, even if it's more ruthless to the lives of everyone else. In Munich, it was humiliating to hear Americans holding microphones telling Ukrainians that the war is very dangerous and bad and is killing Ukrainians. But every Ukrainian who listened to it had lost someone. Some of the Ukrainians who listened to it were combat uh, soldiers who had lost limbs. They know that the war is bad. Ukrainians, more than anyone else, want the war to be over. But simply talking to Russia or signing a piece of paper with it will not bring about that result, and Ukrainians know that very well. Let's remember the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 that United States and the United Kingdom both signed it and provided all the security guarantees, and now it's a piece of paper. Russia's goal seems uh, to get the Americans to praise themselves for organizing a ceasefire, to force the Europeans to retreat in confusion, to force the Ukrainian army to demobilize, and then to attack again. There is no sign that the American side has thought at all about how to prevent this. This is the same mistake that was done in 1994, and the previous US presidents said that they admit the mistake of signing the Budapest Memorandum. It basically forced Ukraine to give away all the weapons, including nuclear weapons, and basically left Ukraine with nothing to defend themselves. And we see what happened 30 years later. Of course, everything can be prevented, but this would require deliberation, planning, concern for US interests, serious discussion with the Ukrainians, and the presence of the Ukrainians and other Europeans in any negotiations. This would require an American policy aimed at weakening Russia and strengthening Ukraine. But this is not happening. Not happening at all. If American negotiators agree with Russia, as seems likely, on a deal that Ukraine finds unacceptable, then the Americans could move to a fully colonial policy toward their former Ukrainian allies. Give us your minerals, they might say, or we will not help you defend the parts of your country that we have not just ceded to Russia. This is unlikely to work since the United States has no such leverage, especially since the Ukrainians have very good reasons to doubt that the Americans will support them in any scenario. But this spiral of weakness creates imperial terms of engagement that Trump finds personally convenient and Musk hopes to make personally advantageous. So, how the European Union allies felt about the Munich conference? Europe was publicly humiliated by representatives of the American administration by the fact that the European continent is now not considered worthy of sitting at the negotiating table. Finally, Europeans understood the risk that Ukraine's strategic interest will be sacrificed politically to the US desire to quickly reach an agreement with the Russian Federation, and that not only Ukraine, but primarily Europe, will suffer from this. And the United States absolutely doesn't promise to protect European countries. On the contrary, they are sending very sympathetic political signals to Putin about reducing the presence of American troops in Europe, that the security of united Europe is no longer a problem for the US. The current security conference in Munich has definitely influenced this understanding because it showed if Europe doesn't invest now financially, politically, and its security so that Ukraine survives and Europe is able to defend itself, then they will lose together with Ukraine in this war to the Russian Federation. In addition, they will not only be pushed out of the negotiation table regarding the settlement of Russian Ukrainian war, but will also, in principle, cease to have any weight in international relations. The first signals that we have seen are already quite optimistic. We have seen the formation of an alliance of interested parties. I would call it that. I also include that here's the position of the foreign minister of a number of European countries who reacted sharply to the Trump's administration's premature refusal to talk about Ukraine's membership in NATO, about American troops in Ukraine, and principle giving Putin carte blanche for a political veto regarding the future of Ukraine. The position of France is optimistic, which will most likely be the main engine of these shifts in Europe. There are historical prerequisites for this. We must remember that France was quite jealous of the idea that the US is the unconditional flagship of NATO, and security in Europe in general. They coincided in recent years with Macron's personal political ambitions. Macron's problem is that he doesn't have absolute support among all political forces within his country. But if we compare the positions of different states, I would say that it's precisely this enthusiasm from Paris, from Macron, that can now give us such a quick result. We can also see who in the European Union and in reality perceive this not only politically but also practically. It's not only the countries of Eastern Ukraine, it's Scandinavia. Germany is finally waking up, which is currently in a very difficult pre election period. Italy is showing a certain strategic approach here, despite the fact that both Putin and Trump hoped for less hawkish position from Italy. Europeans do not believe in Russian war against NATO country, unfortunately, neither hybrid or conventional. Moreover, I've seen how this impression turns into some kind of belief, ideology that the war has entered a protracted stage somewhere over there in Ukraine. Putin doesn't have the resources to continue fighting with NATO or European Union members. But I do hope that the position voiced by US representative in the Munich conference, sometimes in a very rude, unprincipled, frank, and cold form, will change the perception of European leaders of the realities that we have in the Russian Ukrainian war. Because without the involvement of the US in active support for Ukraine, it has become clear to Europe that the future of Ukraine is in question. Because how much resources will Ukraine have to defend? uh, Because how much resource will Ukraine have to defend itself, or with limited resources due to the lack of large defense orders for production in Europe? And if Ukraine doesn't stand or lose in negotiations on some strategic positions, then there will be no more obstacles for Putin to test the strength of the European Union or NATO. However, there are countries in Europe that have taken this challenge more seriously. It is enough to look at the drawing numbers how Poland has increased the size of its own army in recent years. But I'm afraid that the large Polish army will now focus not on sending peacekeepers to Ukraine, but on defending its territory with its own forces, first and foremost. Even those meetings that took place on the sidelines of Munich Security Conference on February 17 in Paris are direct consequences of the statements made not only by the US Vice President G.D. Vance in Munich, but also by other representatives of the Trump administration. For example, Keith Kellogg, who is kind of more moderate. But the key problem for Europe is still the one that has become a cold shower. If something threatens Europe, it will be Europe's problem. Europe has been publicly humiliated by representatives of the American administration by the fact that Europe continent is now not considered worthy by the Trump administration to sit at negotiation table, but actually to find a temporary solution to the Russian-Ukrainian war. In Trump's geopolitical game of fighting China and separating Russia from China's influence, Europe, along with Ukraine, risks losing one. That's why Europeans are waking up literally before our eyes right now. So, What options Ukraine and the European Union have after such a turbulent week? Trump is confident that he will be able to quickly resolve everything with Russia without Ukraine and European Union and conclude a truce before Easter. In this regard, some are now worried that Trump version of the truce will be in fact turn out to be the capitulation of Ukraine and as a result the victory of the Russian Federation and the demise of the current world order. Of course, nothing can be ruled out, but I still do not think this will happen. So Trump's agreement with Putin cannot be acceptable to Ukraine, and this is this should be provided for. Surrender of Ukraine territories to Russian without a fight, recognition of Russian sovereignty over the occupied territories, weakening of the armed forces of Ukraine, establishment of pro-Russian government in Kiev, and refusal of substantial material, not on paper, security guarantees for Ukraine. If at least one of these points remain in the final agreement, Ukraine will simply not sign it, since this would mean signing a death sentence for the state. The Americans will probably threaten to stop military and financial assistance, but this threat will not work because occupation and the destruction of the state are more terrible. In addition, first, the United States is unlikely to stop assistance to Ukraine since Trump, out of pure selfishness, will not want to go down in history as the US president from whom Putin took Ukraine. He doesn't like to lose. Second, Europe clearly intends to urgently and sharply strengthen its support for Ukraine and take a more proactive position in this conflict to play a significant, more important role. And this is why European Union just announced a formula fund of $700 billion to defend Europe and Ukraine. In fact, the US president, for all his loud statements and threats, in reality doesn't have powerful levers of pressure on Kiev. Paradoxically, when Biden was president, Trump had more opportunities to mess with Ukraine than he does now. Then he's he easily and casually criticized the policies of his political opponent. Now he will have to criticize his own, which is not so fun and pleasant. But that's not all. Trump and Putin will never be able to agree on long term settlements without a participation and consent of Europe. The explanation is simple. The key element of any agreement, the provision and maintenance of security guarantees at the insistence of the Americans themselves assumes serious European participation, up to and including the dispatch of troops. Thus, in turn, out of that, no matter how much Trump and Putin would like to show themselves as tough guys who can solve all the problems themselves and agree on everything, in reality, they cannot and will not do anything without the consent and participation of Ukraine, United Kingdom, and the European Union. Because all of this above, those who promise to come to an agreement and arrange everything, and now it is United States and Russia, find themselves in a very vulnerable state to pressure from the outside. Europe and Ukraine not only can, but must disrupt their agreements to knock down their arrogance, humiliate them, and force them to fulfill their European and Ukrainian demands. It's not quite possible to pull off such a feint. A clear illustration of the thesis is the story of Zelensky's refusal to sign an agreement of the transfer of half of the minerals to the Americans. So the Trumpists were sure that Ukraine had nowhere to go. It was signed like a pretty girl. Because of this, the refusal received was a real shock for them. So, no. And then we will, and here it turned out that Trump can punish Ukraine in only one way, but showing himself to be exceptionally cowardly beast who handed over an ally to dictator Putin. In general, the US has swallowed this refusal, and I'm sure that others will swallow it too. Trump has trapped himself with unrealistic promises of a quick peace. And if he wants to fulfill them, then in Saudi Arabia, he will have to continue to put pressure on Putin, but not Zelensky. Well, we'll see what's going to happen. And we hopefully this will be resolved in favor of Ukraine because Ukraine losing thousands of people on a monthly basis to defend its land and independence. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, please share with your friends.